probably.
Oh, I think it makes it. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just want to welcome you to Google Hangout on Air with Dr. Peter Enns. My
Wait a
name's
minute.
Mike.
Wait. Whoa. They told me this was Colbert.
Yeah, I'm his understudy. I'm sorry.
Okay.
It's really jungle out there. So
Well, I'm here. We'll go through with it. That's fine. All right. No problem. Here we go.
my name's Mike Lehman. I run JesusInDawkins.com, where we look at the intersection of atheism, Christian theology, and popular culture, and we're occasionally funny. So I have Dr. Enns here, who's the author of this excellent book, The Bible Tells Me So. It's a beautiful canary yellow, so you can't miss it. And I just want to get this right. Dr. Enns is the Abram S. Clemens Professor of Biblical Studies at Eastern University in St. David's, Pennsylvania. He is the author of many great books, and he's a very impressive individual. That's my own editorializing.
It doesn't say that in the book, does it?
No, unfortunately. No, but yeah. I'm really thrilled to have you here, Dr. Enns, and I'm a big fan of your work. And I was really thrilled to get a preview copy of this book and to learn more about how you approach the Bible and to hear more of your story. So to start off, I just wanted to ask you, why this book and why now?
Yeah, well, I think it's not now. It's been sort of brewing in my head for a few years. And it's, I think, really an outgrowth of a lot of things that I've been thinking about for a very long time, since even when I was in seminary now, 20-some odd years ago. And it's just, it just went into my head, and I said, it's just time to write this book. And I felt I had the freedom to do it, and I felt I had a good opportunity, maybe even an obligation to say some things that I thought were important to say.
Okay, great. Yeah, I guess this will probably be a little difficult, even though you tried to summarize your main argument in a few words toward the end of the book. But what would you say this book is about if you had to put it in a paragraph or two?
Well, I'd say that a lot of the struggles I think people feel, people of faith or coming towards faith or maybe coming out of faith, I think it's a common struggle that people have with the Bible really comes down to having expectations of the Bible that are unrealistic. And by that I mean they're expectations that the Bible itself can't really support. And to relieve the pressure of having to keep defending the Bible to make it act a certain way is something that's very stressful for people. And I think there are ways of, I'm certainly not alone, but there are ways of thinking about the Bible that has expectations that I think the Bible is actually set up to handle and to support, rather than artificial expectations that are driven more by, especially in America, a history of fundamentalist and evangelical concerns about the Bible. And when I put it that way, I'm not trying to badmouth anyone. I'm just trying to be more historical in terms of where some of these ideas came from.
Okay, great. Now, one of the questions I've received from some of my readers is doesn't it appear a bit strained to go about this long process of rehabilitating the Bible to get to what it really means, and doesn't it seem a little overwrought?
You mean, why bother, or is that sort of what's behind the question? Or
I guess I've readers who will say, well, I think the problem is just that the Bible is wrong and unhelpful and doesn't speak to our present age. And if it takes scholars of Dr. Enns' stature and other people to wring out truths from the muck that is the majority of the Bible, then what's the point?
Well, I think I appreciate that question, but I would sort of respond. And in fact, I will respond, since we're doing the show here, by saying that is, I think that question itself presumes a paradigm of Scripture, a model of Scripture that is already the problem. And what I mean by that is that there are plenty of Christian groups for whom the spiritual resources and benefit, and I'll even say inspiration of the Bible, that's not even a question, even though it has properties that we wouldn't accept today as being either rational or spiritually helpful. So I think, behind that question, there's a larger question, again, of expectations of the Bible, where it's either something that's essentially a compendium or a depository of, let's say, historically accurate information that gives us sure knowledge of God and gives us absolute moral commands, more or less, that we have to follow. I think that is the mentality out of which a question like that might arise. And again, I'm not trying to be argumentative when I put it that way, but I think that's
right.
What you can do, just sort of, trying to now ring things and rehabilitate the Bible. No, I'm not trying to rehabilitate anything. I'm trying to describe, I think, what many other Christian traditions have a lot less difficulty accepting. So the problem's not the Bible, which I say in the book. The problem is more our expectations of it. And, maybe to piggyback on the earlier question that you asked, that I could have talked more about, but seeing the Bible as I do, as more modeling for us our own journeys of faith, which sounds mamby-pamby and not really rigorous enough. No, it's tremendous, because the Bible is such a diverse book theologically, coming out of different points of view, different purposes, different things that are happening either in Israel's life or in the life of individuals. There's a lot in the Bible that sort of reflects the journeys of faith of people of old that we can very much connect with. Not to write an encyclopedia of history, but to see what it looks like for people of faith to connect with God in those particular times. And for Christians, of course, we have the whole Bible, which is Christ, his death and resurrection, and things like that. That's sort of the core of it for Christians, not things like that. And
right.
That very much affects too how we sort of approach the Bible and benefit from it in our reading.
Right. And another question I had about how you present the Old Testament, and another aspect of your book that I really appreciated, was that you don't shy away from any of the Bible's really tough passages about violence. In fact, you spend a lengthy chapter looking at the conquest of the Canaanites. I've read books about Old Testament ethics and how to read the Old Testament that doesn't even talk about that. So I was very happy that you spent so much time on it, and that'd be impossible to summarize in a few paragraphs. Yeah. But I guess what I would ask you to do, can you talk about some of the questions you ask and some of the assumptions you question about how we traditionally approach those violent passages that might be helpful for our viewers?
Right. I think the way I approach them is to remember that these are, let's say, the genuine spiritual engagements and reflections with God on the part of an ancient tribalistic people. And I don't see how we can avoid that. I mean, the ancient Israelites were not like the kinds of people you might necessarily invite to church today. They were a rough and tumble people, and warfare was a part of human history at the time, very common, and the gods are fighting for you and with you and support you. And if you win, that means your god can beat up their gods, and if you lose, that means never that the other gods are more powerful. It means that you must have done something to make this god angry. And you see that very much in the Old Testament portrayal. And we sort of have two options there. We can say, well, that's actually describing the essence of God, and that's telling us what God is like. Or we can say, listen, look at the other cultures around them and how much that culture may have affected how the Israelites also perceived God, which, by the way, I see sort of changing a bit too I'm just shutting my phone off here because people apparently, the whole world doesn't know we're doing this right now, so okay.
Unbelievable.
Anyway, wherever I was at that moment, but it's remembering the tribal context and the fact that the biblical writers, regardless of how you define inspiration or revelation, okay, which are not easy concepts to define, but regardless, they're clearly speaking out of that mentality. And if there's anything that the history of at least modern biblical scholarship has shown, because of largely archaeology and finding texts and all sorts of things, if they've shown anything, it's how embedded Israelite culture is in the world around it. That doesn't mean it's exactly the same, right? I mean, no culture is exactly the same as any other, but it means that the Israelites, you cannot tear them out of that ancient context. And for me, it's a much simpler answer to say, listen, they thought about God the way others do, but God doesn't leave the story at that point. We keep moving, and even within the Old Testament, you don't have to wait for Jesus for this. Even within the Old Testament, you have movement and thinking about, well, who are insiders and who are outsiders? I mean, how does God really feel about the people who aren't us, right? And that's a movement in let's say a gospel direction that you see within the Old Testament itself. But that doesn't mean that each part of it, like the Canaanite massacre or extermination, that doesn't mean that has to somehow fit and be justified in, let's say, a broader systematic theology or something of the Bible, where this too is like chapter 3 of the doctrine of God and what God is like. No, I mean, we can always talk about how does this fit into the larger picture of God, but to sort of take that as something that has to be defended, I think is largely creating a problem that doesn't have to be there.
Okay. And another question I had about your book and how you describe the Old Testament, I was really struck by the phrase you used that the Old Testament uses the past to serve the present. And I was hoping you could explain that a little bit for our viewers who may not have read your book yet.
Sure. That's a big question. I'll try to boil it down.
Sorry.
The issue has to do with, let's say, when the Bible was likely written, at least the Bible as we know it. I mean, Israelites were telling stories and probably writing them down for a very long time. But in terms of Israel's own self-conscious understanding of itself as a people united, which is really something that happens in the monarchy, at that point, beginning to write down stories of the deep past, of their ultimate origins, which we're going back now from their point of view hundreds and hundreds of years and even more. They wrote them with their own present moment in mind. So they're not simply curious about, gee, I wonder where people came from, or let's do a historical analysis of the Moabites and the Ammonites, and let's really nail down sort of where they came from. They told the stories of origins, which are in Genesis and Exodus and throughout the Pentateuch, and also Joshua and Judges, but the stories of their own origins told from their point of view according to their present moment among the nations. So, I mean, just, a very quick example, the way the Canaanites are described in the opening chapters of Genesis and the flood story, they never have a chance. I mean, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham is the one who sees his father's nakedness, whatever that means, and he wakes up. Noah wakes up from his drunken slumber, and he's not happy, and he doesn't curse Ham. He curses one of Ham's 4 sons, which happens to be Canaan, and says, "You'll be slaves to your brothers forever." Right? So it's an interesting. That seems a bit over the top. I mean, why not curse Ham? Why not curse Mitzrayim, which is another one of his sons, which is the word for Egypt? I mean, they're sort of the bad guys too. But why Canaan? Well, because it's reflecting later political realities and struggles that the Israelites had with the original inhabitants of the land, and portraying them in a way that makes sense at that present time. So the Canaanites were bad people from the very beginning. Right? That's writing the past to serve the present, to describe the present, to make sense for their own minds of who they are in God's presence as the people of God. What does it mean to follow God right here? But again, see, the biblical story doesn't stay there. Canaanites aren't hated forever, right? They don't stay there. Outsiders are not defined in the same way, even throughout elsewhere in the Old Testament and certainly in the New.
Now, how in this whole concept of the biblical writers using the past to serve the present. In my past, I used to deal with this whole problem. I said, okay, well, the Old Testament's a really wild ride, and thankfully the New Testament is much more concrete. But I'm realizing that is really simplistic and not true. And I get uncomfortable and I'm unsure how to proceed with the authors of the Gospels, for example, and how they treat the story of Christ's birth. You see Christ's virgin birth mentioned in only half the Gospels, and is that another example of the of the past being used and reformulated just for the present, or is that an article of faith that we ought to affirm?
Well, it might not be an either or,
Okay.
and there's several reasons for that. But I think you're picking up on a very important point, that this process doesn't simply stop when you come to the New Testament. You also have biblical writers reflecting on Christ and explaining the significance of who Christ was for their particular communities, which is why we have four Gospels. Even in a different way, Paul does that because he talks differently about certain things depending on who he's talking to. I mean, Galatians and Ephesians don't say the same thing, and neither does Ephesians and all the other letters. So you always have that contextual dimension of trying to understand the past and bringing it to your present moment, which is why there are four Gospels. And the shape that retelling of the past takes will differ depending on the communities that are hearing that story of Jesus, whether it's Matthew or Luke or John or Mark, for example. It will differ, and the reasons why they differ is extremely complicated. We can't nail this down. I mean, why do Matthew and Luke have this very interesting story of virgin birth when the other Gospels don't, and neither does Paul? What are they saying? Is it simply an article of faith? Well, I think whatever they're aiming at is certainly an article of faith, but it's, New Testament scholars do this sort of thing. They investigate, okay, what did that mean back then? How do we understand what that means? Which is a very complicated process, but that's part of the discussion that has to happen. It doesn't have to happen. It is happening. We just have to sort of, catch up with it a bit.
Right. Well, and one of the things I really appreciate about your work is that you really do a great job teaching in a clear way about how the New Testament authors make use of the Old Testament in ways that would not exactly merit passing marks in our seminaries or our universities today. And I really liked, especially in The Evolution of Adam, which everybody should read, by the way, how you talk about Paul and how he was expanding the Adam and Eve story, because he was more concerned about God including Jews and Gentiles in the wonderful work of God's saving action in Christ, and how the solution reveals the plight, and it wasn't that Paul was able to reason to it by himself. Sorry, that was just my own thinking out loud. I just want to say I appreciate those points. Yeah. Moving on, I want to talk about just some bigger questions about how to have helpful dialogue about the Bible between Christians and atheists and agnostics, or just between different flavors of Christians. And what would you say are some of the biggest false cognates that can cloud our discussions of the Bible? So some words that I assume mean one thing and you might assume means a different thing.
Well, Bible for one, because that's overloaded. That's really loaded with meaning for anybody.
Right.
But I think maybe even more importantly, taking a step back from that question, is having dialogue with people who are interested in having it, and that's not always an easy thing to discern. But for example, I don't think we should force the dialogue on any group or individual that at this point just isn't interested in having that conversation. Likewise, whether it's people of different faiths or agnostics or atheists, I think if there is a true wanting to come together to say, listen, there's so much baggage surrounding all this stuff. Can we just try to talk with each other about what do we mean when we say this or that? To me, that's a very healthy thing to do. But I think too often, and you could be accused of writing a book like this and saying you're trying to shove it down people's throats. I'm not. I'm trying to help people who are already there, who are already thinking about these things, and those are the people that I'm interested in having conversations with. But it's easy to have an idea that you're excited about, and let's say a pastor in a church and dumping things, or an adult forum Sunday school teacher dumping things on people that particular community is not asking those questions. The church I go to now, they're all over these kinds of things, so it's very easy to have those kinds of discussions. But I've been in other churches where it hasn't been easy to have those, and I for the most part really didn't try which made me feel sort of empty, and like maybe this isn't the place for me. So.
Okay, and moving on, I was curious to ask you some more questions about atheism and science. So I'm curious, what do you think, or what question about the intersection of science and faith, science and theology really fascinates you the most?
Yeah, well, I guess it's the very large question of the scientific model of the universe, if that's not getting too big here for discussion, and how the very small cosmos that's presumed in the Bible, how to have that discussion with an ancient faith, with an ancient worldview, and by worldview I mean physical worldview, and what we know scientifically. Like many other people, I'm moved by pictures or models of pictures of outer space, and our galaxy, let alone our Earth, is infinitesimal compared to the grand scale of things. And those are not issues that can be solved scientifically. Those are issues that I think are really matters of faith, and just taking a step back and saying, what kind of a God is this? What kind of universe is this? And then how does this story that we read in the Bible of Israelites massacring Canaanites, how does that fit into this very large picture? Is the God of that big thing of beauty and just amazement and space and time, is he really that? Is this the kind of God, and we throw the Jesus factor in too, but is this the kind of God who, does it describe him? Right, and to me, that's the kind of discussion that I have inside my head all the time. What's life about? How does our faith fit into that? And how does this book that we revere fit into that as well?
And sort of continuing with atheism, science, and Christianity, what do you think is the best argument for atheism?
Well, okay, let me do my armchair philosophical thing here, which I'm out of my depth, but I think there are a lot of great arguments for atheism if you presume the ultimacy of a materialistic universe, where the only thing that is truly real is what we can test and what we can see. And I have many friends, I'm not just saying that, who are atheists, and I get it. And I think most thinking people have periods of time and moments, I know I have, where you have this sort of agnostic / atheist period where you go through and you think that things a little bit differently. You learn how to think from the other side. And if you presume that what we can see and what we can test, or what we can figure out through complex mathematical formulas, exhausts the nature of reality, then arguments for atheism are quite easy. But if you presume that that's not ultimate reality, which you can't prove scientifically, which is the catch,
right,
it's a matter of faith, then the world becomes actually even far more mysterious than it already is through scientific inquiry, right? And see, this is one of the things that I don't mean to change the subject here, but Rob Bell's book, What We Talk About When We Talk About God, he begins that book with, 80, 90, 100 pages talking about science and how science actually reveals an indeterminacy. An electron can be there or there. We don't really know. There is built into the fabric of the universe, let's say, a mystery which points us to spiritual realities beyond what we can really discern physically. It's a very interesting point, and I think, those are fun things to think about and talk about. But if you begin with the ultimate exhaustive nature of material reality, which I happen to love, I'm all into material reality, right? But if that's all that there is, then again, I think atheist arguments make tremendous sense. You can't prove God scientifically or logically or rationally. It's not that the faith is irrational or illogical. It transcends that. It can't be contained in those categories which are part of scientific discovery.
Well,
not to push this too far, but that's why when I look at the universe, sometimes I say, is there really a God who's like in charge of all this? But most of the time, I say to myself, what kind of a God is this? I mean, true incomprehensibility at this point, just an unfathomable nature of God that makes me pause and think twice about saying anything, quite frankly, and not writing yellow books, like this. Just retreating into a monastery and praying and eating once a day for the rest of my life. That's the kind of thing that it's just very interesting to me, and it sort of gets me up in the morning.
Mm. Well, given all of that, why would you say that you're a Christian, not a Jew or a Muslim or any number of other faiths?
Well, I think, as many others have said, that if I had been born elsewhere, I don't know what I would be. I can't say that I'm a Christian because I've looked at all the evidence and it makes the most sense. I think it has much to do with where I was born and the influences that I had. And that's not any less a God thing than, I looked at the data and the analysis and I became a Christian because it makes the most sense, right? I think God's providence and God's love and mercy is much bigger than we think it is. So, I think about that sometimes, and it doesn't really bother me very much. I don't know what God's going to do with the rest of the world. It's frankly none of my business what He's going to do. I have to take care of my own backyard.
Of course, yeah.
So I can't. I just know what I am.
Right.
And this is me as one human being on this pale blue dot, as Carl Sagan says. Maybe around for 80 laps around the sun. This is who I am, and I cannot transcend this moment. And it's for me a beginning point of thinking and processing about the nature of reality and who God is.
Right. Well, I want to ask you one more question about your book, and then a few about something really important, like popular culture and action movies. All right. But the last question about your book, reading your book and reading your work, it seems like you're saying that we should read the entirety of the Bible in the light of Christ, through the lens of Jesus, and that everything else is to be read through that lens, and we aren't to read Christ through the lens of Joshua, for example. Mm-hmm. Where does that mean that any description of Jesus in the New Testament, we can take that to the bank and we don't have to reinterpret that for now, or where do we determine who Jesus is?
Right. Another one of the perennial challenges at least, or problems of anyone thinking through the Bible, because even though there's tremendous unanimity, let's say, among the four Gospels, there are different flavors. And not only that, you have the perennial issue of, is what we're reading here part of the Gospel writer's retelling of that story, which accounts tremendously for why there are differences? Or we getting, quote, the real Jesus here? And I think I read a while back, Luke Timothy Johnson has a tremendous book, The Real Jesus, and that made me think about things in a different light. And one of the things he points out is that the real Jesus is the canonical one, even with all the diversity and things that don't quite overlap very well. And to ask, let's say, a rationalistic kind of question, which is what maybe the Jesus seminar might ask, that's from a true Christian point of view, that's a doomed quest. You can't nail down this is what the historical Jesus is really like. We've got him down about 95%. You can't do that with any human figure, let alone somebody as complex as Jesus. So the real Jesus is the one of diverse post-resurrection, next generation reflection. Mm-hmm. Right. So and I'm very much of the opinion that if I had been following Jesus around while he's preaching, I wouldn't have gotten it either. That's something that you only get over time with the reality of resurrection behind you, which I believe. Looking back and telling the Jesus story in such a way to get the magnanimity of it across that couldn't have been done at an earlier time. So in that sense, the passage of time is not a negative. It's actually needed to percolate. And you do have that Jesus described differently in different contexts by different audiences.
Thank you. And speaking of the passage of time needed to percolate, I have a really important question. Who would you choose as your favorite action figure out of Arnold, Stallone, and Liam Neeson? And there has been some more passage of time with Arnold movies and Stallone movies, but it's really important.
I think Liam Neeson, because he can act, and and he has a delightful accent. So I don't know. They're all good in their way, but not really. But Liam's the guy. And what's the movie with Kidnapped, where his daughter was
Taken?
I mean, one of my daughters was like getting on a plane within 2 weeks, so he's like my hero, because I would do that. I would have the brain. I would have those particular set of skills, and they need to be running away from me. So I want to be Liam when I grow up. But anyway, okay. Any other penetrating questions there, Mike? Or
Oh yeah. So if your life were turned into a movie, who would you want to play you?
I've never contemplated that for 1 millisecond in my life. I can't even imagine what my life would look like as a movie. Tom Hanks. We're
not
about
Zac
the same
Efron?
age. No, we're about the same age, and I think he's one of the best and most diverse actors of my generation. And he's funny. And yeah, that'd be pretty cool. But that's probably not going to happen. I think you don't have a psychotherapist there, do you? Sort of analyzing my answers and stuff? Taking notes. Oh, you gotta keep away from him, man.
Yeah, they're really hoping that you're gonna go with Zac Efron. Actually, they're really disappointed.
Okay.
But the last question.
That's your problem, not mine, Mike. That's don't push your stuff. Don't put your stuff on me. Anyway.
The last question. This is a question I love asking. If you could have dinner with any 3 people who have ever lived, a long evening dinner.
First of all, I don't eat dinner for a long time. I'm far too hyperactive. I mean, ask my family. If I sit there for 10 minutes, it's a long time. One of the most tedious experiences for me is to go to a restaurant for 2.5, 3 hours and have to talk to people, because I don't care who it is. I would want to get up and do something else after about 20 minutes. So you're asking me a question that just doesn't sing to me at all. If let's say Jesus or Paul, I'm not sure if it would be Jesus. I might want to talk to Paul and say, where'd you get this stuff from, and why didn't you say X, Y, or Z? I'd probably pick an athlete from the past, who might not be with us anymore. I'm not sure it'd be Babe Ruth. I'm a big Yankee fan, but I can see something like that. Nobody too smart, though. When I eat, I don't want to have deep conversations. I just want to keep it light. So, not that Paul is light, don't get me wrong, but
Right.
I don't know. I'll have to email you those after my next session with my therapist to figure it out. Anyway.
Well, Pete, I appreciate you rolling with these questions and
Sure.
and how we covered a wide range. But folks, for everybody who's watching this now or is watching this in the future, I just want to commend this book to you. The Bible Tells Me So. And whether you totally agree with him or you don't, Dr. Enns is totally worth reading. He's fantastic, really clear teacher, and occasionally funny, / very often funny. But Pete, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Mike. Have a good time.
You have a great day.
Okay. Thank you.